today is entitled, Will Jesus Christ Return to the World in Our Day? Are we living in the last days of the world's history, as some claim today? This is an exposition of the 24th chapter of the great Gospel of St. Matthew in the New Testament. For 2,000 years, true Christians have held to the doctrine of the second coming of Christ. In fact, every 23rd verse on an average in the New Testament speaks of the coming of Christ. Many dates have been set for the second advent, and all have failed and all will fail. This book prohibits the setting of any date for the second advent of Christ. Even Jesus himself in this very chapter of Matthew 24 stated this. It says, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Verse 36. So there it is as plain as day. Anyone who sets a date, dismiss it immediately, my friends, for it will prove to be false. And the disciples themselves sought an answer to this question of Jesus himself, for it tells us in the 3rd verse of this chapter, as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Master, tell us, what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" Notice the two are put together, the second advent and the end of the world, the end of our civilization as we know it. And friends, so important was the answer given to this question that the Holy Spirit inspired 3 whole chapters to be written in answer to it. That was St. Mark 13, St. Luke 21, and Matthew 24, the greatest of all. And these 3 chapters give the answer. In Matthew 24, it's divided into 3 sections, and 2 main events are emphasized in this chapter. First, the siege and destruction of ancient Jerusalem, and secondly, the second advent and the end of our civilization. Why blend these 2 events together in this chapter? My friends, the destruction of Jerusalem was an event so devastating it marked the end of the ancient world, the end of an age. And Jesus Christ uses the destruction of Jerusalem as a picture or type of the destruction of our world and the end of our civilization. And that's the significance of this chapter, you see. And Matthew 24 presents a panorama of the 2,000 odd years from the first advent to the second advent of Christ. It foreshows the events, the main events of the Christian era down to the second advent. So it plays an important part, or should do, you see. And I want you to notice with me some of the main events Christ outlines throughout the Christian era, and then it shows us where we stand in the great stream of time, which is very important to us. And the first event was this. Jesus said, "They shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you. You shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake." Verse 9. Now there's the first prediction of persecution upon the early Christian church. Was it fulfilled? Very much so. First of all, by the Jewish leaders and people. Their persecution of the early Christians was relentless. Remember that after their rejection of Jesus as their rightful Messiah, and crucifying him, and denying his resurrection from the dead, which they still do, they then turned on the early church, and the disciples, it says, were scattered abroad in that terrific persecution. And the synagogues were called fountains of persecution, because in them were hatched the diabolical plots to try and destroy the Christians. And friends, the Jews were so vicious in their persecution that they even influenced the pagans wherever the Christians went to turn upon the Christians. And as you know, in time the Roman Caesars themselves were influenced and turned on the Christians, and in that period 2.5 million Christians were done to death in martyrdom. Did it hinder the Christian church? No, it did the opposite. For as the writer of that time said, the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church. Wherever the blood was shed in martyrdom, it was such a powerful testimony. It convinced thousands of the truth of the Christian faith, and it spread throughout the then known world, my friends. As the Apostle Paul wrote, it had gone to every creature under heaven of that day. So what a marvellous feat it was, you see. And it's interesting to notice that the vicious treatment by the Jews of the Christians is what led to the Catholics becoming so hostile to the Jewish people. So it's easy to understand, you see, why that was so. So now we come to the second main event of this great chapter. And here, notice what Jesus says. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, referring to Jerusalem, whoso reads, let him understand. Let them in Judea flee to the mountains. Woe to them that are with child, and them that give suck in those days. And pray thee that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Now this was referring to the siege of Jerusalem. And friends, the prayer of the Christians was for 39 years that their flight would not be on the Sabbath nor in the winter, and it was fulfilled. For when the Romans surrounded Jerusalem, they withdrew, we are told, and the gates were opened briefly, and the Christians were able to get out. And it was on Wednesday they fled, and it was in the autumn, thus fulfilling their prayer. And not a single Christian perished in that terrible siege of Jerusalem. Now, what is the abomination of desolation that Jesus mentioned here? In the corresponding chapter of Luke 21 and verse 20, it tells us, it gives the answer. And here he translates it this way. When you see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. And this, of course, referred to the armies of imperial Rome. The Jews, remember, because of their rebellion, were hostile against all men. And finally, Rome decreed to destroy that nation and sent over a powerful army, surrounded the city, and the Jewish nation was brought to its end. This was in 70 AD, and there occurred perhaps the most horrendous siege in all history. The Jews, in their fierce hunger, some of them even baked and ate their own children, believe it or not. And about 1 million were slain, and about the same number sold into slavery. And remember, friends, all these details were foretold 1,500 years by their own prophet Moses. And they came to fulfillment by the very letter, you see, as Moses had declared. And so Jerusalem's destruction took place. And so terrific was it, it marked the end of an age, the end of the ancient world. A new era commenced with this tremendous event. Now we come to the third event in this great panorama, verses 21 to 22. And Jesus says, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. What a sad prediction. Now this great tribulation, some confuse it. They think it's the tribulation that's to happen at the second advent, will be prior to the second advent of Christ. That is coming. That will be short and swift. But this time of tribulation, the great tribulation, was to last for a long time. And friends, it was perpetrated by the great Antichrist mentioned in Bible prophecy. He had been featured in the prophecies of Daniel, and also St. Paul had alluded to him in 2 Thessalonians 2 as the man of sin. And both Catholics and Protestants are agreed that the man of sin is the Antichrist, the little horn of the prophecies of Daniel. And friends, the prediction indicated that the Antichrist would rise after the death of the apostles, when imperial Rome would fall. And it certainly rose, did the great Antichrist of prophecy. And soon the era of persecution, of tribulation began. And the prophecies state that the period of supremacy, the period that the Antichrist would reign, would be 1260 years. And that was fulfilled from 538 AD to 1798 AD, 1260 long years of persecution of all those who were true to Christ, you see, fulfilled by the Antichrist. And that, of course, was the Dark Ages, or much of it was the Dark Ages, and true Christians were destroyed by the millions. Reliable historians tell us that from 60 million to 120 million died a martyr's death over that 1260 years, the greatest that ever was or ever shall be, such as was not since Jesus, since the creation of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Thank God. He will never permit such persecution again. He will never permit such a long period of trial for his people. And the tribulation that's to come will be a very short one, just before the second advent. It'll be swift and sure, or short and swift. And it's interesting to notice now what Jesus said about this time of great persecution of the Dark Ages. He says, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. That's how severe it was, you see. And he declares, or predicted, that the days of persecution would be shortened. Now the tribulation, the whole period of the reign of Antichrist, which was 1260 years, ending in 1798. Did persecution extend to 1798? No, it did not. It stopped short of that date. Why was it shortened? How was it shortened? Let me tell you. Persecution was so severe throughout Europe that Europe was losing the best of its citizens. They were either being martyred or they were fleeing the country for refuge in other lands. And the time came when those countries were severely affected by this, you see, and the European rulers reacted at last against the persecution. And the leaders of the persecution, the organisers of it, who were they? They were the Jesuits, believe it or not. The Jesuits were responsible, you see. And the European leaders were able to convince the Pope of the day, Clement XIV, to ban the Jesuit order, which he did for a season. And as a result, persecution ceased. And the last martyrdom was in the year 1773 AD. That was 25 years short, as the diagram shows, of 1798, you see, when the reign of Antichrist ended. 25 years short. And so, my friends, the time of tribulation was shortened, just as Jesus predicted it would be, you see. And here now, we are given by the Bible a guide, a special guide by which we can test our interpretation of this prophecy. And this is very important. And notice now what Jesus said in verse 29. He says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, after the last martyrdom, the persecution, shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light. What a prediction! Now when we read the Gospel, the same parallel chapter in the Gospel of Mark, notice how he puts it. He says, or translates it, but in those days, in the 1260 days, 1260 time period, that is, prior to 1798, after that tribulation, that means after the persecution, after the last martyrdom, after 1773, shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light. Unquote. Mark 13:24. So there you have it, you see. And as I said before, the last martyrdom was 1773. So there was a 25-year period, you see, when persecution was shortened. And then it says, in that period, after the martyrdom and before 1798, in that time, it says the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. Now, what a test, a rigid test, for no one can interfere with the heavenly bodies. My friends, was the sun darkened in that period, after that tribulation and in those days? Were the heavenly bodies affected in that period? The answer is yes, they were. The sun was darkened and the moon did not give its light. It was not an eclipse. It couldn't be that, because that's normal. That's not unusual, you see, not abnormal. There must be some unusual interference in the sun and moon. And it was so, my friends, in that period. In what way? In the year 1780, 7 years after the last martyrdom, there took place the famous Dark Day, or Black Friday, of May 19, 1780. On that day the sun rose as usual in the morning. By about 9 a.m. it began to become obscure. By midday it was as midnight. It wasn't an eclipse. And as Webster's dictionary printed in 1869, that particular edition, this is how it reads concerning it. It says, the dark day, May 19, 1780, so called on account of a remarkable darkness on that day. In some places persons could not see to read common print in the open air for several hours together. Birds sang their evening songs, disappeared and became silent. Fowls went to roost. Cattle sought the barnyard. Candles were lighted in the houses. The obscuration began about 10 o'clock in the morning and continued till the middle of the next night, but with differences of degree and duration in different places. Now notice, the true cause of this remarkable phenomenon is not known. Webster's Dictionary, 1869. And friends, no one knows the cause of the famous dark day. Weak attempts have been made to try and explain it away, but none of them will stand up. My friends, the cause of it is unknown. It came as a result of the prediction of Jesus Christ centuries before, fulfilled to the very letter. And R.M. Devens, in his work, the wonderful, entitled Our First Century, 1776 to 1876, says this, that this darkness was not caused by an eclipse is manifest by the various positions of the planetary bodies at that time. And of course, that has been confirmed, my friends, by astronomy. And the Universal Encyclopedia, referring to the dark day, written in 1900, says this, dark day, men filled with awe and alarm. And it says causing great alarm. And that's the dark day 1900. And this event, my friends, concerned mostly North America. Why? We believe there are very definite reasons that explain why this would be. And this is coming in a later lecture on Revelation chapter 6. Now it also says, Jesus also predicted the moon shall not give its light. And that night when the moon rose, at first it was red like blood, a full moon, proving it was not an eclipse. And then it went right out of sight, and the night was so black that even men and horses could not find their way home. So dense was the blackness of the night. And then Jesus predicted another event in the heavenly world, in the sky. And he said, and the stars shall fall from heaven. What stars? Not the fixed stars, so-called, but shooting stars, the meteors, you see. But have not meteors always appeared in the heavens? The answer is no, they have not. According to records, there's no trace of any meteors before 900 AD. And since then, very rare appearances. But my friends, this prediction was dramatically fulfilled after the darkening of the sun in 3 startling falls of shooting stars, which they called the Leonids. Why the Leonids? Because they came from a spot in the heavens called the constellation of Leo. So they called them the Leonids. And friends, there were 3 mighty falls of these stars at this particular time. The first was in 1799, which appeared mostly in Central and South America. The second one was in 1833, which appeared in North America. The third was in 1866 in Europe and extended right down to the Middle East. 3 great falls of the Leonids, you see, at that time. And notice what W. Fisher, an authority, in his Ancient Leonids, page 80, says. The first spectacular fall of meteors was in 1799 AD. It was observed mostly in Central and South America. And then he says, in page 79 and 80, the most spectacular fall was in 1833, the most magnificent meteor shower on record. And M. Millman, in his work The Telescope, published in June 1940, says this: for nearly 4 hours, the sky was literally ablaze. More than 1 billion shooting stars appeared over the United States and Canada alone, referring to the 1833 fall of the meteors, you see. And friends, it startled the population of the day, and many recognized it as a fulfillment of the prediction of Christ in Matthew 24. And it's interesting to note that in 1798 began the great science of meteorology as a result of the falling of the Leonids. And it's interesting to notice the verdict of the scientists of the world of that day. They claimed that because the Leonid showers were 33 1/3 years apart, and they were, that from now on the Leonids would come every 33 1/3 years. And so when 1899 came, the next 33 1/3 years, the world was warned to watch out for the Leonids. So the world watched. They waited and they watched. And what happened? Not a single shooting stars flashed across the heavens. I wonder why. You know, if they had come regularly, they would no longer have been considered any particular sign of any special significance. But they happened at a particular period. What period? Surrounding 1798, the date ending the reign of the Antichrist. And the book of Daniel indicates that that date marked the final period of world history called the time of the end, or as we say, the latter days, or the last days. And they began in 1798 AD. And that was the significance of those signs that were hung out in the sky to tell mankind the last days had begun, you see. So how important that was. And so, friends, you see, the last days have now been continuing for over 200 years. And some say, that's a long time. I tell you, my friends, what it does say is that the second advent could be very, very near. We could be in the very last of the last days. And when we examine all the other predictions concerning it, there is no question that it is, you see. And so, we come now then to some of these signs in this very chapter. And notice now what Jesus says. I turn now to verse 6 of chapter 24. And Jesus says, you shall hear of wars and rumours of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Friends, wars are not a sign of the return of Christ. There's always been wars. Ever since man existed on the planet, there's been war. But then Jesus gives the great sign in the military world of the end. And he says in verse 7, for nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Not army against army, but now whole nations against whole nations. Whole kingdoms against whole kingdoms. You see, once war was between army and army, but the sign in the last days in the military world is total war, involving the whole nation. The manpower, the women power, all the resources of the nation. And the first war that fulfills that prediction, my friends, was World War #1, the Great War of 1914 to 18. And Winston Churchill in his history declares that when that war came, it was different from all previous wars because it involved the whole nation, and it certainly did. And when World War II came, it involved the whole nation more than ever. And those of you who went through it, as I did, know full well how true that was, my friends. Total war. And if a third war eventuates, may God forbid, if it does eventuate, it will be more global, my friends, than any of the previous wars before it. Woe betide the human race if a third war comes. Now then we notice Jesus predicted that associated with these world wars would be 3 other great events. And notice what they are. He says, and there shall be famines. Famines? But haven't there always been famines? Yes. But what he means is famines. That would be world shaking, in which millions would die. Not only world war, but there were world famines. And my friends, this began to be fulfilled soon after World War II. From that time, never has the world witnessed such massive shortages of food. On the other hand, never have there been such masses of food in store, which has not been spread to those who need it. Sadly, never have so many people been so hungry. Never have so many died of starvation in these last few years. The media doesn't reveal the full truth of the disaster. But my friends, Jesus' prophecy of famines has been fulfilled to the very letter, no question. And then he said with it, after that, with famines, he says, and pestilences. The Greek means plagues, diseases, pestilence. And this involves the animal life, the fish life, human life, vegetation. There'd be diseases, pestilences, etc., plagues in all these areas. And friends, in spite of the remarkable advance of medicine, there is more disease in the human race, in the animal world, the fish of the sea, in the plant life than ever there has been before. Over 80 years ago, my father grew a superb vegetable garden. He never used any sprays, believe it or not, except in the apple orchard, which we had to spray for cotton moth, you see. But for the other, no sprays, no pests, it seems, were known at that time in New Zealand, you see. That's how wonderful it was to garden at that time. And you may remember how soon after the Great War there rose the great Spanish influenza epidemic. It went around the globe where no human being even went. And as a result of that epidemic, 25 million people lost their lives, including my own sister, way down in little New Zealand, way back in those times. And there have been other things, my friends, the statistics of which are shocking. Cancer. Just imagine the millions that are dying of cancer, and not only among humans, but in the animal world and the fish world. So much so that flesh food, many believe, is becoming dangerous. And this is why millions of people are now vegetarians. It's understandable. Then we have AIDS, and more millions are being wiped out by that disease year after year. It's increasing year by year. Heart disease, diabetes, and many others. And even now there are some medics who are warning over the media that even in the hospitals, it's a dangerous place to go, is the hospital, because you can contract diseases there which you won't get anywhere else. Friends, we are living in a very alarming situation in regard to disease, just as Jesus predicted. We've all heard of mad cow disease, and it's becoming worldwide, but it's been kept quiet. And the experts have predicted that ere long there'll be an outbreak of mad cow disease that will put all other epidemics in the shade. I tell you, we're in for a tough time. And now there are some medics who are claiming that Alzheimer's disease is the same as mad cow disease. And many have been suspicious of this for some time. It's now being admitted by some. And so, my friends, we can expect a tremendous increase of this epidemic. Now, not only did Jesus say that there would be famines and pestilences, etc., but now there's one other event that he mentions. And notice, and earthquakes in divers places, meaning numerous places, earthquakes. Is this so? When we study the records of earthquakes over the last 2,000 years, notice the statistics. In the first 1,800 years, there are just over 2,000 destructive quakes. In the 19th century, 100 years only, there were 2,119 destructive quakes. In the 20th century, up to 1908, there were 30,000 destructive quakes. How about that? In 1950, there was a major quake, according to the experts, every half hour of time. A major quake in that year. They now say that our planet is shaking somewhere all the time. That's how frequently quakes are taking place. And they're becoming more and more disastrous. And the classic example, of course, is the recent tsunami in Indonesia, with its far-reaching destruction. And friends, this tells us we need to be very much aware of the future, for more destructive earthquakes are ahead of us, and they'll be more frequent. We ought to take note, my friends, as to where we build and how we build for the future. And then I want you to notice what Jesus says. After relating these things, he says, all these are the beginning of sorrows. What does he mean by that? That term beginning of sorrows refers to birth pangs, the beginning of travail in birth, you see, alluding to childbirth. And just as birth pangs, denote the arrival of a new life, so what Jesus is saying here, that these events are to us a sign of the birth or arrival of a new world that's going to be brought in by the Creator. A new world. Good news, you see. So that's the significance of these events, my friends, you see, that are outlined in this chapter. So this leads to the question, how near then is the coming of Christ? Now notice what Jesus says in verses 32 and 3. He says, now learn a parable of the fig tree. When its branch is tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. How true that is. When you see the leaves and the fig tree in the spring, you know, ere long, summer will be here. Now notice, so likewise, says Jesus, when you see all these things which we have mentioned, know it's near, even at the doors. Or the one version says, at the gate. So my friends, these events that have been outlined tell us Christ is at the gate. He's very near. The second advent is due, you see. That's the message. But how near? Listen, Jesus answers, verily I say to you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Now there, he's talking in definite terms. The generation that sees these things, my friends, won't pass off the field of action until the great event comes. So, which generation is seeing these things? Seeing them on a world scale. Which generation? Only one. Our generation. No other. My parents never saw the conditions we are seeing today. They never dreamed such conditions would take place. And my friends, so certain is Christ in regard to this. Notice what he says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Verse 35. See how certain it is? And some ask, well, why then does God permit all these disasters that are bringing such pain, such suffering to mankind? My friends, the author of evil, the author of disasters, is not God. It's Lucifer, who in this book is termed the prince of this world, the god of this world. He was permitted to take over this world and set up his own kingdom, but that's another subject. He's the one responsible for it. And Scripture tells us why the tremendous increase of these events at this particular time. As Revelation 12 says, woe to the inhabitants of the earth and sea, for the devil is come down to you in great wrath, for he knows that he has but a short time. You see, my friends, Lucifer knows the prophecies. Lucifer knows of the world conditions, and he knows that the time is very short when he'll be brought to book, you see. And so he's come down in great wrath in order to destroy as many as he can before the finale takes place. But let me say, my friends, God is using these calamities to try and wake up those who are willing to listen. And notice what he says. I read Isaiah 26 verse 9, the gospel prophet, and he says, when thy judgments are in the earth, and I tell you, God's judgments are certainly in the earth right now. When thy judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world will learn righteousness. And friends, that's absolutely true. Many people are learning from the horrific events that are taking place around us. They are realizing that there's something coming. There's something big ahead. And here the scripture tells us what it is. It's the second advent. It is due, you see, the great second advent, the climax of human history. And many today are learning what is coming. They're getting ready for it. And how important that is. For remember, Christ warned, and now I want to read verses 42 and 44. And notice, he says, watch therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord comes. Therefore be you ready, for in such an hour as you think not, the Son of Man comes. My friends, Christ will come unexpectedly. He comes, it says, as a thief in the night, not secretly, not silently, but unexpectedly, you see. And these tremendous events at this time are telling us he's coming very soon, very soon. So how does one get ready? As he admonishes us. My friends, that's the purpose of these lectures. That's the purpose of these programs. That's the purpose of these presentations, to help men and women, wherever they are and whoever they are, to get ready for the great event of the future. That means one's eternal destiny. Oh, how important to be ready. May God impress your mind to look into these things and determine that you also will be ready for the great event that is coming. Is my sincere prayer.